I get to speak first. I just want you to know that. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the British Library this evening for Echoes of the Silk Road, Cities of Trade and Culture, with our stellar panel. Writers championing their chosen city along the famous corridor of trade as well as cultural exchange. My name is Jonah Albert. I am one of the library's cultural events producers. This particular event is linked to our current exhibition, A Silk Road Oasis, Life in Ancient Dunhuang. Has anybody seen it? Oh, that's nice. More of you should go and see it. It's really quite beautiful, actually. It gives you a rare glimpse into the ordinary lives of people who lived, worshipped, travelled through there, worked there. It's really, really, really good, and I am biased. As well as that particular exhibition, we've got another exhibition on medieval women, again, looking really, really, really good. So I'd encourage you to also go and see that. And note a date for your diary, the 7th of December, where we'll be having a Silk Road Bazaar in the entrance hall. And in here, we've got Medieval Fest, a whole day of medieval stuff. It's going to be good. It's going to be good. I would like to extend a very special welcome to those of you who are watching this stream and you're with us live this evening. A very, very special welcome to you. We will, at the end of the conversation, be taking questions. If you're in the audience, just raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. If you're with us online, then there's a question box just below the video, kind of here, and you can pop your question in here and one of us, i.e. me, will answer the question on your behalf. So while the conversation's going, do start thinking about your questions. More housekeeping from me. Please turn off your mobile phones if you haven't done so already. We're not expecting a fire drill or for the alarm to go off, but if it does, exits can be found there and there. So to make your way out. So this is going to be really, really good. You're going to have a very, very enjoyable evening. We're in the hands of our host and chair, Rebecca Riddell, who's a historian, a best-selling author, an award-winning producer, and the director of the History Festival, HisFest, that the library is really, really glad to be hosting. So, Rebecca.
Thank you for that intro, Jonah. That was great. It's nice to be at the British Library again. I feel really inadequate here because I'm in very esteemed company. We have Colin Thubron, we also have Islam Issa, and we have Bettany Hughes in the centre there, if you didn't know already. What we're going to do this evening, we've got limited time, but we're going to try and do it. We're going to have each of our speakers make their own personal case for their individual city of interest. And I will introduce them properly as I come to them. So the first half of the session will be discussing the various cities, and then we'll be putting them in the context of the Silk Roads overall. So first of all, Colin, I will introduce you. I will read this because, as I say, everybody is very esteemed. Colin is an acclaimed travel writer and novelist and the winner of many prizes and awards. His first books were about the Middle East. Then in 1982, he traveled by car into the Soviet Union, a journey described in Among the Russians. From these early experiences, he developed classic travel books. Among them are Behind the Wall, which was the winner of the Hawthornden Prize and the Thomas Cook Travel Award. Shadow of the Silk Road, To the Mountain in Tibet and the Amur River, and The Lost Heart of Asia as well. In 2007, he became a CBE, and in 2008 to 2017, he served as president of the Royal Society of Literature. Colin, you're here to talk about Samarkand, I should say. Can you put it in context for us? Describe to us where this place is and how it fits along the Silk Road.
Well, it's almost, you could say, equidistant between the Mediterranean, one end of the Silk Road, and Xi'an, or Chang'an as it was called, the great Tang dynasty capital of China, at the other end in the east. And it sits, I don't know how people are good on the geography, I'm not often very good, but the two great tributaries of the Oxus River, the Amur Darya and the Sir Darya, which drain into the Aral Sea, and it sits between them. So it's very much a city that is, if you like, at the heart of the Silk Road. On one side is the long journey through Iran and Central Asia to the Mediterranean. On the other, the often very dangerous deserts of China, the Taklamakan, eventually getting to the Chinese border. So it's very central.
And do we know much about I'm sure we do, but do we know much about the origins of the place?
Almost all these cities, you find the origins much earlier than you thought. Somebody digs and they find that it's actually 15,000 BC or something. But actually the foundation of Samarkand was supposedly about 700 BC. And it's controversial, but that's about it.
And it's had a really interesting history. It's absorbed lots of different cultures, lots of different thoughts, and lots of different architecture. There are some key spaces that you're particularly interested in. We were talking about this in the green room. Would you mind sharing them with the audience?
Well, the city that I expect some of you have been to, I'm sure, and that everybody knows, is the city of Tamerlane, the great Mongol conqueror, the last of the barbarians, if you like, who dies in 1405. And his empire stretched literally from the Mediterranean to China. And Samarkand was his capital. He brought back artisans, scientists, poets. He stuffed the city with everybody he had captured that he thought was any use. And so, as many of you will remember, it's a city, at least you see it from somewhere away, and it's blue domes, and it looks magical. And there are at least 4 wonderful sites in it. One is the tomb of Tamerlane himself, which is quite beautiful. Another is called the Registan, which is a tremendous square surrounded by Islamic madrasas, 16th century, which Curzon no less called the noblest public square place in the world. There's another, which is a vast, over-restored, I think, mosque built by Tamerlane himself called the Bibi Kanun. And then there's a Vale of Tombs, which is quite beautiful, where the warriors and queens of Tamerlane are buried, which is almost like a lexicon of Persian tile work, absolutely lovely. And all these places exist still in Samarkand, waiting to be seen.
It's interesting when you're talking about those spaces, it's interesting how many of them are to do with either a religious space or a place of remembering, so a tomb. Do you think that speaks to the tone of Samarkand itself, or?
Of remembrance. Well, tombs always are. They're like sort of monuments. And it's extraordinary that the tomb of Tamerlane, the last great barbarian conqueror, should exist. It's rather as if we knew where the tomb of Attila the Hun was, or of Genghis Khan. And here it is, and it's amazingly beautiful, because although he was a warrior, an appalling one, I mean, his campaign in India alone apparently left 5 million dead. This was a man who was ferociously interested in culture, in astronomy in particular, mathematics. He took these scientists on campaign even, so he could grill them with questions. I mean, he was obviously terrifying. And he brought back gorgeous sort of treasures from wherever he conquered, illuminated manuscripts, which he loved gazing at but couldn't read. And so it's extraordinary. But the other strange thing about it, about Samarkand, is that there's a much earlier city. It's called Afrasiab. It's on a great ruined plateau above Samarkand. And this was the principal city of the Sogdian people. And for a whole millennium, for the, for the time, the high period of the Silk Road. The Sogdians were the great traders of the Silk Road, and they were merchants who were exceedingly, according to the Chinese sources at least, cunning and deceitful, and very, very clever, and also great warriors. So it's an interesting picture of it.
I'm just interested to know a little bit more about the people, actually, just off of what you were talking about. Was this a mobile space? Did the population change quite a lot with migrants and things, or?
Well, it was, I think the whole of Sogdiana, as they called it, this whole area around Samarkand, very big area, was an area in transit, for sure. And they were, from time to time, actually conquered by both Turks and Arabs. But they continued to trade, they continued to exist, to make sort of peace treaties. They were very clever. And although they were often under the suzerainty of other empires, other peoples, they went on. And sometimes, as in the 6th, 7th centuries at their height, the Sogdians were a major empire. And then, I don't know if some of you would have seen in the British Museum the great fresco taken from almost like a palace in this place from the heights above Samarkand. And it shows them very magnificently caparisoned, riding camels and elephants, and with embroidered clothes. They were powerful, and obviously very considerable through all this period. Really, the city was invaded by Alexander the Great, Samarkand, and from that period on, really, one finds them almost increasingly powerful until they're destroyed in the 13th century AD by Genghis Khan.
I'm going to move on just for time reasons, because I think we can come to invasions and conflict, and we'll definitely be talking about Alexander, I'm sure, as well shortly. But I just want to briefly ask you about the Timurid Renaissance, because of course with every city, with every place, there's the real and tangible, but then there's also the cultural. So could you tell me a little bit about what that was and what it meant for culture?
Well, the Timurids, named after Tamerlane, Timurling, were a dynasty that he founded. They didn't last very long, but one finds his own grandson was an astronomer, and you can still see the extraordinary site of his observatory in Samarkand. So that's remarkable. He identified 200 unknown stars, Ulubeg, his name was, and managed to identify the stellar year so accurately that it was within about 2 seconds of modern electronic research.
Wow.
So that was one of the legacies of Tamerlane. The other was, of course, the Mughal Empire. The whole Mughal Empire of India was descended from the descendants of Tamerlane.
Okay, here's where you need to make your case for Samarkand being the best of our three. So I'm wondering, you called it the lost heart of Asia in one of your books, or it was referred to as that. What is it that draws you to that place? Why is it so special?
I think it's sort of boyhood romance in origin, I'm ashamed to say. It's not like Timbuktu, here was this extraordinary, landlocked, mystical, poetic city. It was written about long before people knew really where it was. Handel composed on it. Keats wrote about it. Goethe, Marlowe, of course, the great drama, Elizabethan dramatist, and Flecker, of course, the Golden Road to Samarkand. I was imbued with this as a boy, and I thought, I didn't know where Samarkand was. I didn't realize it was sunk away in the middle of the Soviet Union there, where I would probably never get. But it was the sheer romance of this place, really, which was sunk away in sort of mythic history, as far as I knew. And that went on. In addition, as an adult, the Soviet Union was a challenge to me. I think I wanted to know about the countries that we've been brought up to fear. At least my generation brought up to fear the Soviet Union, with the great yellow peril of China just behind. And Samarkand was somewhere immured in there, and I wanted to go to Central Asia from youth.
Oh, I'd love to talk to you about that. Hopefully we get some time at the end about the experiences of doing that after the fall of the Soviet Union. But we're going to move now to Bettany Hughes to make the case for Istanbul. So Bettany Hughes is an award-winning historian, author and broadcaster, and her books include Venus and Aphrodite, which was shortlisted, I should say, for the Runciman Award, the Sunday Times best-selling Istanbul, which was again shortlisted for the same award, the Hemlock Cup, which was shortlisted for the Writers Guild Award, and also Helen of Troy.
I never win anything. I'm always...
She will.
I think this is a winner of the Runciman Award, so I am not worthy.
Next time.
Next time, don't you worry.
But you may not win, but you have also made lots of documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, National Geographic, and the History channels. You're a professor at the New College of Humanities and a research fellow at King's College London. And Bettany also has been honoured with numerous awards. You lie, including the Medlicott Medal, Europe's Cultural Heritage Prize, and an OBE for services to history. But the pressure is on today because we need to hear about Istanbul. Could you describe to our audience, many of whom I'm sure have been there already, but could you describe Istanbul, where it is, why it's important in terms of the Silk Road?
Certainly, and also, I actually didn't realise it was a competition. Great, bring it on. But I can say I have won this time because Istanbul is simply called the world's desire, the queen of cities, the greatest city on earth by its contemporaries. And sometimes it doesn't even have a name, it's just the city, capital T, capital C. So obviously it is the greatest of these cities. And before I answer the geography, I have a gentleman who emails me about once a week saying he's discovered the tomb of Attila the Hun. And I've realised that I've been ignoring him for about 7 years. And I thought,
what?
Maybe he has, because they're quite intense emails, but it could be. So we'll go together and see if we can find it. Well, so Istanbul, famously on the Bosphorus Straits, a divider or a connector between Europe and Asia. Although I have to say it drives me mad when people talk about it as this bridge between East and West, for two reasons. One is it's not a bridge, it's a place in and of itself with an extraordinary culture that has grown out of the soil and the waters around it. And also, it's actually more importantly, I think, a connector between north and south, if anything. So if you think, how many people here have been to Istanbul? Probably, look at that, almost the entire audience. So you will obviously know that up at the end of the Bosphorus Straits, you have the Black Sea, and then what is now Ukraine and Russia. If you travel south through the Sea of Marmara, it's next stop Africa. And actually, that connective line, I think, was more important than the connective line between East and West. Of course, it was originally, it was all one landmass. And for me, it has just extraordinary dynamism and brio and charisma, and it has a sort of sense of itself. I think you always have to meet Istanbul on the front foot, or Constantinople, Byzantium, Augusta Antonina, as it was briefly called as well. And if you travel up the Bosphorus, you'll know it's an incredibly difficult stretch of water to navigate. And one of the reasons for that is that in around 5,500 BCE, there was a huge rise of sea level. So the sea rose by 268 feet in 300 days, which if you do the maths, is extraordinary. Floods over 600 square miles of land, torrents of water came down what was a river, and actually underneath the salty Bosphorus, there is a submerged sweetwater river which runs in the opposite direction to the channel. So it's one of the reasons that you get this kind of fret of water there. And if that river was on land, it would be the sixth biggest river in the world. So it's, it's a place of sort of such extraordinary levels and layers of complexity. So there are, I mean, you know, do we have not just an hour, but 100 hours? There's so many reasons why I could talk about its, unique nature. But one of the reasons I love it is that it has long been a citizen city. It's a city where the geography is so extraordinary that it's almost as if it's a character that's bigger than its leaders. So it's always been a city of protest and rebellion and revolt, because you feel that people who live there have this sense that of power that the city itself gives them.
I was going to ask you about the East meets West nature of things and how problematic that might be, but you've already answered that, so that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the architecture,
Yes.
the architectural aesthetic of the city. What does it look like? What if we were to walk there? I mean, most people have been there, but let's imagine we haven't. But what would we look out for? What's the buildings of historical importance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is never walk there or drive there, because you'll get stuck in traffic jams. Always travel by water. It's a city that was described by Procopius as being garlanded by water. So, of course, you have the Sea of Marmara, the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and it's a city that is best viewed from the water. And if you do that extraordinary journey up the Bosphorus and look at the historic skyline on the European side, then really interestingly, what you're seeing when you look at the Ottoman period architecture, you're actually looking at a skyline where 50% of those buildings were funded or founded by women, really interestingly. So it's a city where women's agency has always been really large. And these are women who were in the imperial harem who could inherit wealth. And there was this notion that by sponsoring these beautiful buildings, they were acts of permanent charity. And it was one of the things that the women of the harem could do. So they were kind of city builders there. But of course, then if you deal with this kind of levels and layer history, you go back, obviously, through the Ottoman period, back to the extraordinary Byzantine Empire, so-called the Eastern Roman Empire, which is, again, if any of you have been, I'm sure you've all been down into the cisterns, the Basilica cistern, very recently restored. And then if you go beneath that, you have a Roman city, an imperial Roman city, and then a Greek city. And then, of course, it has its own culture. So, you know, the story goes that the Greeks founded what was then Byzantium. You know, it's this kind of fantastic story that they come from the Greek mainland and they sail across the Mediterranean, and they originally go to Chalcedon on the opposite side of the Bosphorus, which was called the City of the Blind, because they didn't realise how perfect Byzantium would be, which is where the kind of historic heart of Istanbul is now. But actually, of course, the Greeks didn't found Byzantium. I love the Greeks, but they invent the word history, and they are very good at writing themselves into it. So, you know, they declare But there was actually a local Thracian population, and we know that from the archaeology. Really interestingly as well, going back 2000 BC, there seems to be what looks like Central Asian sort of, they aren't actually Turkic, but they're described as Turkic-style Kurgan round burials. But beyond that, if you go back to 8,000 years ago, there's remarkable evidence that is coming up out of the building projects in the city. So there's, again, if you've been recently, you know there's a new metro system, there's a new tunnel under the Bosphorus. I mean, and they just discovered incredible things. So they discovered the world's oldest wooden coffin, the world's, which has a woman curled up in it in a kind of fetal position. The world's oldest canoe paddle comes from what we call Istanbul, and you get this sense of this plucky community of people living there using spoons made of wild cow bone. They've actually left the imprints of their feet in the mud. So we have the footprints of the women, men and children from that time, 2,000 of them. And there are so many of these archaeological remains. There are actually 90,000 crates of them that are still waiting to be examined. So it was, you know, it was a remarkable place, but a place which was as much, as I said, about the water and the kind of bucolic nature of the land, as well as the city. So just when you go to bed tonight, just lie back for a moment and think about those first inhabitants canoeing up and down eating with spoons of wild cow bone, and living amongst 9,000 species of flora. So it would have been like this sort of paradisical, extraordinary meadow-like landscape and pistachio forests. So they would just wake up in the morning and pick fresh pistachios and fresh figs for breakfast.
Sounds idyllic.
It was
We
idyllic.
need to go back to that.
Nobody could beat Istanbul.
It wasn't supposed to be a competition, but I think Jonah set the tone, so I followed on. But of course, it's not a competition because they're all equally amazing.
Yes.
Just one final question for you before I move on to Alexandria and Islam's story of Alexandria. We've obviously, actually there's two questions, but I'll put them together. We've obviously heard about the everyday people, these imprints that they've left, but it's also a city that's been used and conquered and claimed, people like Constantine, for example. Can you speak a little bit to that? And then finally, maybe one or two sentences on just what the draw is for you, why it's so special for you.
Well, I mean, so many names, these sort of big names of history have been there. And it probably is worth talking about Constantine, who, of course, gave his name to it at the point where it was Constantinople. And there's something that I really love about Constantine, and I love about his legacy in the city, which is a legacy that I think you can still feel and experience today. So sort of two things. If you go to the Grand Bazaar and look at the column of Constantine, which is still there, this porphyry column that he had erected, and you have to imagine, originally, it was 160 feet high. It was crowned by this sculpture of, we think, Constantine, but it was sort of also looked a bit like the sun god Helios. It also looked like the Roman god of war and sun, Sol Invictus. It also looked a little bit like Jesus. So it was this kind of fantastic meld of everybody. And then the stories that were told about it, it had this beautiful solar crown. And it was said that the nails that were used to crucify Jesus were melted into that crown. And that if you go down underneath the statue, there was buried the axe that Noah used to build the ark. And then carry on down underneath the kind of pedestal itself, and it's where the baskets that Jesus used to feed the 5,000 had also been tucked in there, along with a statue of Athena, the goddess Athena, which had been brought from Troy.
I think I know where Attila the Hun's buried.
Exactly. But, you know, isn't that brilliant that people wanted it to be this sort of magpie monument that had a relation to both the old gods and this kind of new spiritual, religious empire? But the thing I love about it, it was also a place that refugees could gather, this column of Constantine. And from Constantine's renaming of the city onwards, there was always this sense that it was a city of sanctuary. And they had, from the 7th century CE onwards, a refugee official, a sort of refugee master, whose job it was to look after those who came to the city. Theodora, one of my kind of most favourite women, this empress, there's this fantastic letter that she writes where she talks about the fact that her builder in the palace is complaining because she's invited so many refugees into the palace that he's worried that the floor is going to collapse. It's the most brilliant kind of bit of NIMBY, NIMBY history. But it was always this place that said that if you had just cause, there was this notion that you could go there and seek sanctuary. And we see that right the way through the period of the First World War, where there are these beautiful photographs of poor young orphans, Muslim orphans who'd been displaced by that activity around the Great War, who were being given home and succour within the mosques. So they're sort of sitting there with these little bowls and their blankets drying. Of course, it was where people fled after the fall of Al-Andalus in the 15th century, Jewish populations. And in the Second World War, Jewish families were given the passports of Muslim students and put on trains, and they were allowed to travel to Istanbul and were again given sanctuary there. And of course, through the refugee crisis and the fallout of the Syrian war now, there are more refugees in Istanbul than there are in any other modern city. So I sort of love that about it. And I love the fact that that's been a constant throughout its history.
Thank you for that lovely overview. Islam is, I will give your introduction before we get on to the questions. Islam is an award-winning author, broadcaster and curator, named by the BBC as one of the UK's most significant new thinkers. He's Professor of Literature and History at Birmingham City University, and he's written several academic books, and one of them's got an amazing cover, actually, hasn't it? In joke. He's curated internationally renowned exhibitions at public venues, including Shakespeare's birthplace. He writes regularly for newspapers and magazines such as BBC History magazine, and has presented and featured in television and radio documentaries on the BBC and Netflix. His book, Alexandria, The City That Changed the World, is a Sunday Times and Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year, and the winner of this year's Runciman Award.
Yeah.
So well done. Awkward. So, Islam, let's travel to Alexandria then. Could you tell us, I mean, we know where it is, but we want to hear it from you. Could you tell us where it is and what it looks like and the geography of the area?
Sure. And the book before this, on Shakespeare and terrorism, the front cover is painted by Rebecca.
Oh. Thank you. Thanks for the plug.
Alexandria. Alexandria is originally founded 331 BC by Alexander the Great and named Alexandria by Egypt, not Alexandria in Egypt, which I think is an early indication for us of the fact that it was seen as somewhere near Egypt that connects with Egypt. But it is in the north of Egypt, obviously on the Mediterranean. Through the Mediterranean, there's a link clearly to Europe, and southwards and westwards, clearly a link to Africa. Southwards through Nubia, through the south of Egypt, to the Horn of Africa, to East Africa. Westwards to the Maghreb region, Morocco, and so on. And through this position, it's also a link to Asia, not just through the Levant, which is sort of to the east, but also to Aden and towards Yemen through the Red Sea, because it's to the east we have the Red Sea. When Alexander arrives, there's already quite a complicated canal network that the ancient Egyptians had built. So there's a network already that connects the city of Alexandria around Egypt, and as it connects to the where Suez would be today, if you like, it has access to the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and in turn the Indian Ocean. So it's a place that does connect the three continents, but also founded in a way where it's not really part of Europe or Africa. It's something that connects the two. And for context, Egypt has long existed because Alexander arrives halfway between us and the pyramids. So that's how old and accomplished Egypt already is. So he has the advantage there of going to a place that's already got a reputation, it's already got trade networks, especially southwards and eastwards as well.
You mentioned Alexander the Great there. He's obviously heavily associated with Alexandria. Who else is, though?
Well, Alexander the Great's associated with Alexandria, but interestingly, he never sees a single building rise in it. So he runs off for his next adventure. So short attention span, or he goes straight to Siwa, and then obviously we know that he goes eastwards as well. And part of what he does is create the founding myth that lives on through things like the Alexander Romance, where we're told that he got down on his knees when he arrived. I mean, it's a slight tangent on your question, but unlike perhaps other cities, this is a city that's conceived from scratch. There's only fishing villages there, and there's an island called the island of Pharos, which is probably uninhabited when he arrives. But it's in the consciousness of the Greeks because Pharos is mentioned in Homer, for example. And legend has it that Alexander sees Homer in his dream, or a Homer-like figure who tells him about this island where loud the billows roar, and that he gets up and goes there. So the legend has it that he designs the city, gets on his knees and designs the city on the sand with barley grains. and that the birds come and eat those barley grains. And I say that as an Alexandrian, where the founding myth is important to Alexandrians. And he was told at the time, according to these legends, that this is proof that it will be a feeder of the world. And I think that's got something to do with what we're talking about today in terms of its potential. But another key figure would have to be Ptolemy, because Ptolemy is his friend and general. When Alexander dies, there's a rush for his empire, if you like. And among the people who gets a slice of the cake, and a very nice one in Egypt, is Ptolemy. So that would be Ptolemy I. And in many ways, Ptolemy is the person who builds Alexandria. Even if it was conceived by Alexander, Ptolemy builds it, and he does so through a number of means, one of which is a famous hijack of Alexander's tomb, and bringing the corpse of Alexander to Alexandria, and building a city around that cult, and then through other projects that include, of course, the lighthouse and the library, both of which were essential to the character of Alexandria. The lighthouse as a symbol of power, but also something very practically important when it comes to lighting the harbours for trade, as Alexandria becomes a key trading hub. And the idea of the library as soft power, really, that you can generate power through generating knowledge.
Thank you. There have been so many incredible people associated with Alexandria, Hypatia, many other thinkers and other people. But I wonder if we can think about the architecture. So you've touched on the Library of Alexandria. What else do we have there? Well, if you were to go there today, because obviously we don't have that. If you go there today, what would we look out for? What would be the historical sites that you'd guide us to?
Well, I think it's an example of a city that has such a long history that you have different groups putting their stamp on it through their architecture. So, it starts off with the Ptolemies, but then you also have the Romans, and there's the Egyptian, the Ptolemaic, the Roman, and then, of course, you have different Islamic dynasties, and you have a big Jewish population and a big Christian population, historically, for the Jewish population, and certainly today for the Christian population. So there is a kind of joke that if you want to see ancient Alexandrian architecture, you're better off going to like Rome, because that's where things have survived. So Alexandria has a city under the city, and there's a joke, among the police force in Alexandria that I've been told, which is if you stick your head under the ground, you'll find your hand under the ground, you'll find a monument, or you'll find an artifact. But stuff has been discovered under the ground. So we have catacombs, very significant catacombs. There's also a Roman theatre that's been discovered. Villas, Roman villas as well, where people would have lived. So those are among the most important things. If you go to the citadel, which is where the city was founded, on Pharos Island, where Alexander arrived, and he built a causeway connecting it to the fishing villages. The citadel is there, but also you have the remains of the lighthouse there as well. But it's just the remains, and it's not. It's more exciting in terms of the wonder it brings as a wonder of the world, rather than as the monument itself. There is a new library now, built in close proximity to where the ancient library would have been. But that library, is only a few decades old.
And we've spoken the two previous spaces about how and why these particular cities are special. But you track your ancestral history in your book through Alexandria, so there must be that extra resonance for you and importance. But could you tell us why? What's the draw? What's the appeal of Alexandria to you?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to this. The personal side I'll come to, but I think it's the conception of the city. It's not built, it's not conceived as a result of a war or as a result of geographic expansion. It really is a concept that Alexander arrives here and thinks this is at the intersection of three continents. how can I make this a successful city? And they come up with these two ideas. One is if we bring people from different parts of the world to live together in relative toleration, I say relative, in relative peace, then we can be a world trade hub. And it works because you have people moving into the city because they need people. There's only a few fishing villages there. So you have Egyptians, you have people from the Levant, you have lots of Jews moving to the westwards towards Alexandria. There's even evidence of Indians at the founding arriving. You have Scythians, so people who today would be in Russia and Ukraine, as well as obviously the Greek, Sicilian, the ones we might expect. So for me, the concept that you bring people together in that way is really exciting, and it is an economic strategy. Then you couple that with the other strategy, which is if we create knowledge, disseminate knowledge, keep all the knowledge, and they went to extreme measures to do so for the library. There was a papyrus embargo. You couldn't export papyrus, so that rival libraries couldn't keep up. If a ship docked into the port, it would be searched not for contraband, but for books. And if a book was found, it would be confiscated, and they would make a copy of the book and give you the copy back and keep the original, and so on. So, going to these extreme measures to gather knowledge, and really is well ahead of its time as well. This idea that soft power is possible through that knowledge. So I think that's what makes Alexandria special in its conception. And for me, I guess it's that little route that stays with me wherever I am. The memories I have there, but also this quest I had as I was writing this book of trying to understand my own background. And I joke in the acknowledgements about looking for Ancestor the Great rather than Alexander the Great. And, archives are quite difficult to navigate in Egypt, but, going back a few generations and realizing that these were people who lived in this city through all its different times. They lived in a city when it was a hub for Europeans, when it was a hub for Jews, it was a hub for Christians. And then, funnily enough, forcing my father to do an ancestry test. I don't,
I don't like the sound of this.
Not physically, but asking him politely until he agreed. And, when it came back, the scholarly rigor in the book is much better than this, by the way, but it came back 97.5 Alexandria.
Wow.
That was very strange. I still don't completely know what that means. Were they there before Alexander the Great? But I think there's a personal element for sure.
Thank you for that lovely overview of Alexandria. But obviously, as we know, these cities are cities in and of themselves, but they're also connected to the wider world, which each one of you has touched upon. But let's talk about the Silk Road and how they connect to that. Colin, what is the Silk Road?
Well, the Silk Road is already... the term Silk Road, as I'm sure plenty of people know, was coined by a German called von Richthofen in the 19th century. So it's a very recent term. And the Silk Road wasn't just one trajectory going from east-west. It was a multitude of different roads. And there was no sort of track. I think you might expect, traveling along it as I did, that somewhere there'll be a nice little path. There it is. Of course, there's not. It goes all over the place. And in particular, it branches when there's a desert, a terrible desert like the Taklamakan, which is now in the Uyghur country of northwest China. When a bitter desert like this, it branches around, of course. It also, incidentally, wonderfully, is such a dry atmosphere there that caches of letters have been discovered of very early peoples, silk that is literally corroded into bundles. Silk was used as a currency very often, and all sorts of artifacts which would have disappeared anywhere else, disappeared in Istanbul or Alexandria. but here they are. And so the Silk Road, literally the end point, you might say, would have been Rome or Alexandria or indeed Constantinople. And the beginning, sort of classically, in Chang'an, the great Tang dynasty capital of China, or even further east. So the Silk Road is normally thought of literally this trajectory going across, but it goes all over the place. And as Islam says, you could say it goes down the Red Sea, connects Yemen, brings up the perfumes of Arabia, and it's not just silk that travels, of course. So it's a rather modern term, the Silk Road. Nobody in those days would have said, "Oh, I'm going on the Silk Road." It just said, "Oh, I'm trading pomegranates between somewhere and somewhere."
But on that question of trade, and I'll just open this up to all of you, whoever has an answer first, I guess. On the question of trade, what was it? So silk, we expect that was traded along this route or multiple routes. What else was traded along this pathway?
Well, it's hard to say what wasn't traded. I was
Right.
absolutely everything at one stage or another, from living things like the horses that went from Iran to China, the great horses which were so valuable to them in war, to slaves, unfortunately, which were traded, and camels, of course. But everything, fruit, all the herbs and the flora of China that either came by sea or went or began to go west. Everything, ironwork, glassware, which apparently was perhaps taught to the Chinese by Central Asians. Viniculture, the vine, again introduced to China by the Sogdians, going the other way. Lacquerwork, ceramics, you name it. There was nothing that wasn't there. Coins as well. The reach is astonishing. One finds silk woven into the head of an Egyptian mummy from the 10th century BC, Chinese silk. One finds tombs deep inside China. The dead have their eyes closed by Byzantine coins. It says there a million examples of such transients on the road that you could go on being boring about.
It's not boring. It's interesting. Very interesting.
And I think that's the thing. It's sort of of reconceiving that it's such two-way traffic. I don't know, for some reason, when we think of a road, we often think of just a sort of, like a one-way route. And like exactly as you said, the exchange was extraordinary. So if you go to places like Azerbaijan today, and to, in Shaki, which was a centre of silk production, and you go into these beautiful sort of mansions that were built with the wealth of the silk in the 18th century. And you're there looking at Venetian glass, as you say, in the windows with paint that has come, we know, from Constantinople. And then go a bit further south into there's an exclave of Azerbaijan called Nakhchivan, which is on the Iranian border. And if you travel there, and it feels very Central Asian, but if you dig up the ground and you find all this fake Chinese pottery because it's locals, that's what's, I think, in a way, we always talk about it not existing, but I sort of think it did exist as this sense of connection, and a sort of family belief that you're not alone. So the fact that you have these remote communities, so pretending that they're importing perfect Chinese pottery, but manufacturing it themselves, gives you that just sort of a bit of an immersion into that. I mean, exciting experience of being along that road. Yeah.
So we've got these are the tangible things: the pottery, the silk. Perfume, I don't suppose is tangible. Maybe it is, kind of vaporous.
They had plants that certainly were used for perfume. So it does go quite far back. 4th century BC, Ptolemy II in Alexandria, but there's an inscription in India that suggests that he was sent medicinal plants, as a gift. All the way from there, so that would presumably arrived with those kinds of tradespeople. An interesting one that comes to mind for me is a kind of super yacht that the Ptolemies had. So Ptolemy IV had a kind of they call it a boat. You know, when you imagine Cleopatra used it, actually, the famous Cleopatra later, it was more of a super yacht, but it had, you know, Indian stone in its dining room, suggesting that was transferred across. And there is a piece of papyrus that was found in the 20th century, so quite recently, that had a full sort of inventory of what came from India at the time. So things like medicinal plants, but also elephant tusks was one of the heavier things that was transferred across. So you do have some really interesting evidence of what it might have been and how far it travelled as well.
There's also ideas as well. The transmission of ideas and culture. I wonder if we can look to that a little bit. Maybe Colin, you could speak to our ideas and.
Yes, again, one finds that my favourite Samarkand people, the Sogdians, very much responsible for the introduction of Buddhism into China, a huge thing, as well as Zoroastrian, Mazdanism, Nestorian Christianity indeed, all travelling along this extraordinary Silk Road, partly by monks, partly by merchants. One has changes in writing. The Sogdian script, again, was given to the Uyghur, the contemporary Uyghur, and to the Mongolians in an Aramaic script, you know, the Aramaic being the language of Christ. Again, these astonishing connections. And yes, ideas, Chinese inventions, of course. One doesn't know how many of them, or if many of them, started up in Europe. Bacon, I think, said that there were three great inventions of his period. There were gunpowder and the magnetic compass and printing. All of them were invented in China long before in the West. Who knows which ones affected the West and how if they were transported at all. But certainly things like the mechanical clock, for instance, and the extraordinary invention of the stirrup in equine harness was a Chinese invention that traveled right across to Europe. The stirrup doesn't sound much if you've been in a riding school. It doesn't seem very important, but in fact it was the stirrup that supported an armored knight on his charger. And these were the tanks of the medieval age, if you like. And without the stirrup, they wouldn't really have existed. You could jokingly think that the whole of the medieval age in Europe was invented by China. They invented the stirrup, which created the knight, and then the medieval empire ends, of course, with the invention of gunpowder, which exploded fortresses, gunpowder that was discovered in China. Who knows, probably, certainly the gunpowder invention moved across the Silk Road, very likely, from east to west. These things are extraordinary, and the more people discover, the more complex it becomes. People imagine that paper, for instance, certainly it was discovered in China and moves via Samarkand, where there was an enormous paper factory, to the west, and paper, which, of course, is unimaginably important in our age, and paper which was used for everything in those days. They made statues out of paper, even clothes. Paper was tremendously valuable.
Thank you. I'm very aware of the time. We are going to come on to audience questions soon. So if you're in the audience here, do start thinking about what you might want to ask. And if you're at home or watching online, have a think as well. We can go to you as well. But before we finish this discussion, I just want to touch on the legacies of the Silk Road. So Islam, what has been the impact of this, maybe in relation to Alexandria as well?
Yeah, I think religious culture is a very important aspect. We've already mentioned that, haven't we? But emissaries were often sent, or humans who can talk to people about their cultures were often sent, whether on purpose with these products, or they just decided to hang around and stay somewhere, especially if it's a city like Alexandria. And we end up having essentially migration as a result of it, and that really diversifies Alexandria. And we can deduce that there was intermarriage as a result of that as well. So, for example, an interesting figure in Alexandria's history is the explorer Ibn Battuta, who is, 14th century, who, when he's in Alexandria, he gets the idea to become an explorer because he meets somebody who tells him, you should see my brothers in Pakistan, in Sindh, between Pakistan, India, and China, by which he meant people who'd come here and lived in Alexandria for a bit and then went back, or people who'd married and then gone back. So you have this kind of legacy of diverse culture, religious culture, diverse families as well. I think beyond that, with the discovery, if you like, of the Cape Route and the ability to go around Africa and not have to go through Alexandria as part of the Silk Route, if you like, Alexandria begins to lose some of that importance. But we see today the importance of that region nonetheless through the Suez Canal and all the effects of the Suez conflicts and just how important that part is, that strait is until today. And I think the legacy extends to kind of what we today term colonization, in the sense that it proved that these areas were so important to take control of because of the routes that they provided.
Thank you. And Bettany, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was just thinking as you're talking that the translation of ideas is just phenomenal, and the colonisation of ideas as well. I mean, it's so, what you were saying, all these things that we kind of associate with a so-called kind of Western culture, actually, even monks, we sort of think of naming the rose and that monks are a Christian thing. And of course, monks come from the Buddhist tradition, and monasteries and nuns and nunneries, from Buddhism, way before Christianity latches onto the idea. But I was actually thinking that maybe Silk Roads, the legacy, is that it reminds us what a sort of strange and beautiful species we are, in that we invest all this effort in trading useless things. Some of the things are really useful, but some things are just sheerly beautiful, and it's as I said, a huge amount of human energy. And we've talked about this before, that as a species, we are hardwired for wonder and awe, and silk is very practical, but it is also simply beautiful, and it's a beautiful light material. And I had this sort of explosion of understanding. I thought, well, of course it's because it's so light to carry, and yet it's worth so much. But it's a material onto which can be stitched whole stories of other nations. So it's an artwork in and of itself. And, if you think about it, again, we've talked about this before, but at that terrible time of COVID, when the world was ending, or we thought the world was ending, and there was a real danger that there was going to be mass death. I'm sure everybody in the room suffered loss. So it was a really extreme time. And if you think in the first, 2 days of the first 48 hours of that crisis, and we did the thing of we stockpiled loo roll and we stockpiled tin tomatoes. And then that done, on the third day, we started to share poetry and music and images of paintings on our phones. But we thought we were all going to die, but we still thought that was something that was worthwhile doing. And I think in a way, one of the legacies of the Silk Road is a reminder that beauty matters and that we need it, and that it's worth investing in it, and it nourishes us. So maybe that's a legacy.
I think that's a really lovely point, and it's just made me realise that I did not mention in your introduction your gorgeous new book, Seven Wonders, which it speaks to that enormously. So yes, it's a great book. Colin, how about you? The legacy of the Silk Road, or what we think of as the Silk Road?
Oh well, it's so difficult. So picking up on what you said about silk, it is a wondrous thing because it was so, in a way, in itself unutilitarian. They made it into all sorts of things. Silk, they even used it as writing paper. You wrote precious things on silk. The Buddhists wouldn't, because silk involved the death of the silkworm, and so they would never write a sacred text on silk. But it was used for a mass of other things, of course. And by the time it reached Rome from China, it was vastly expensive.
Yeah.
Of course, because we've gone such a long way. But one does read that the Romans themselves were suspicious of it because Diocletian, I think, banned it because it was ruining the economy of the empire. It was so expensive. And one finds it sort of, the philosopher Seneca said that it was so transparent that it was as if women were walking about naked. He was scandalized.
wow.
Yeah.
These women in silk were walking about.
Yeah.
In fact, Cleopatra was known, I think Lucan describes Cleopatra as first meeting Caesar, not Antony, but Julius Caesar, clothed in lawn silk, so he could kind of see her more than he should have done.
Yeah.
After presumably being allegedly rolling out of a
Really,
silk rug.
A carpet, yes.
So that's the legacy. Cleopatra rolling out of a silk rug with barely anything on.
That's enough.
I think that's perfect. I think that's a great note to move to audience questions. If we have an online question that's come through, because I don't want to forget the online audience, can we have that first? Do you have one over there, Jonah? Or you're all right for now. So do we have an audience question? We have somebody at the front here.
Thank you. Fabulous discussion. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could answer the question that many people ask about to what extent the people at the two opposite ends of the Silk Road ever kind of interacted with each other, or whether it was just a sequence of middlemen and intermediaries like the Sogdians. You know, did someone in Alexandria ever meet someone from Xi'an, etc.?
The answer is no. No, the second point is right. They didn't. It was a relay race. So that one finds certainly in ancient times, the Romans and the Chinese knew almost nothing about each other. In fact, curiously, the Romans thought that the Chinese were a culture that was ruled by philosophers, and their king, the king of China, apparently had 700 wives that moved about in golden chariots drawn by oxen. So that's as little as the Romans knew about China. The Chinese, on the other hand, thought of Rome as also, oddly enough, being a realm governed by philosophers. And they, some of the Chinese said, moved about in little white carriages and tinkled bells when they wanted to go left or right, which would have clogged up Oxford Street rather badly. But so on the whole, almost nothing. Almost nothing they knew of one another, even in quite late times.
I was just thinking about, you were talking about the Byzantine coins that they put on their eyes, and I think they're almost always fake Byzantine coins, you know, which is interesting. They just, people wouldn't have known that, but it felt really cool that they had this coinage from elsewhere. Yeah.
Turn them into jewellery.
Yeah, exactly. And just think of the stories that they told about each other. That's the thing, you know. It's really. Must have been so vivid. As you describe all these sort of strange fantasies. And there's another one that the Chinese thought that the people in Constantinople had lambs that sprouted out of the ground like plants, and then you harvested them. But you sort of think, what started that story? You know, what's the kind of tale that's got completely perverted through time? How does it begin?
It reminds me of that spaghetti story in the 1960s. Spaghetti was growing on trees. I think there's a BBC report.
Oh, that's right.
That the Italians grew spaghetti on trees.
Yeah. Don't they?
We have a question over there.
Thank you. Is it possible to give a sort of ballpark time of how long it would have taken to get from somewhere in China, say, to Istanbul?
Yeah. Do you know? I don't know.
I think it would depend. It was a relay. No one person would have done the whole journey, or virtually never. It was always a relay. So I don't know, I'm afraid.
But, I mean, the travelling time was a lot shorter than we imagine. I think it's, you know, again, we sort of think, gosh, you know, how did it must have taken months and months. But people, they were constantly travelling, both the ancient and the medieval period. You know, we're again a sort of peripatetic species. So have you done that?
No, but I mean, they also had tactics. So, for example, in Alexandria, they'd only go towards India during the monsoon winds, because then the ship would be propelled to go faster. So they certainly had the speed in mind, and would they've written about it. They've written, you should only travel at this time of year when the wind is like this towards the east. So they would have tried to cut the journey time through those kinds of methods.
Do we have any other? Oh, wow! Lots of hands now. We'll go to the lady at the front there with the pink top.
Thank you. I had a question about Siwa, because I used to live in Alexandria and I used to visit quite often in the 80s, which is a hell of a long time ago. I wonder if it's changed, but what role did it play in the Silk Road trade? And I know that there was a temple there of Amun's temple. There were so many things going on there, men marrying men. Are these things all true, or are these, is it fiction?
I mean, so Siwa was sort of southwest of Alexandria in Egypt, famous for its oases. In the ancient times, it was called, the city of trees, because people were surprised at how green it was. It did have this kind of reputation as a sort of liberal city. Alexander, when he founds Alexandria and doesn't wait to see the buildings, that's where he goes. He runs off to Siwa, to this oracle that had been part of the Greek consciousness related to Amun-Re, in order to find out if he's divine. And he finds out that he is divine. So it plays a big part in the future, because it gives him the confidence to then carry on eastwards. So Siwa was important in the creation story of Alexandria. I think in terms of trade, Alexandria was, as far as Egypt was concerned, Alexandria was a kind of sorting hub and storage hub. So things that would have come from south, especially grain, of course, would be packaged and sorted in Alexandria, ready to leave from one of the two main harbours. So certainly Egypt played a big part including Siwa, in the trade, but Alexandria was where it sort of was sorted, and it was the biggest exporter of grain to Rome for many centuries.
We had a few hands up over here. The lady with the orangey red top over there. You just wait for the microphone. Oh, it's coming that way.
I was looking at the exhibition at the British Museum, and I was fascinated that there was industrial sabotage and espionage going on. One was about, I think it was, obviously the silkworms being smuggled out. I wonder if you know of any other of these sort of things that were going on, because I'm quite fascinated how that sorts of information flowed through.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? And again, we sort of think of this as being a kind of, terrible behaviour of current multinational corporations. And it was absolutely happening, in the kind of late Roman periods and beyond. I know one thing that in Istanbul that they were very famous for is for selling premier silk, particularly to Vikings. So we always forget that Vikings were obsessed with silk. They loved nothing better than a purple silk scarf from Constantinople, and they used to have purple silk sails as well. And the Byzantines they were just so sort of, they were real intellectual snobs, and they thought, well, the Vikings will never notice. So they basically only gave them the sort of scrapings from the factory floor. So you know how, like, when we found out that tea bags is literally what they've been sweeping up from the bottom of the factory. It was the same with the silk for the Vikings, but they told them that it was the kind of premier goods. So there was all that kind of, it was not quite espionage, but definitely kind of dirty tricks in terms of commerce.
Silk, of course, was a Chinese monopoly. They didn't want anybody to discover how it was produced. And there's a well-known story of a Chinese princess who married a ruler in Khotan, further to the west, and took it out in her headdress. There's a beautiful little plaque in the British Museum with that myth inscribed on it, I think from about the 6th century. Then it's supposed to have been taken further to Byzantium in the staffs of some traveling Nestorian monks. So silk cocoons were smuggled out, basically, supposedly. It's probably not really true. The secrets leaked out more incrementally, I think. But there are these nice myths, and the Chinese couldn't hold the secret in.
When was the secret revealed? When did people start?
I don't know. I mean, clearly, if you get silk in the found in Egypt, in the mummies from the 10th century BC, it's leaked out somehow, the actual silk. It's the manufacture that was the big thing that the Chinese wanted to prevent. And that I'm not sure when it went up, but I think by the 6th, 7th centuries, they were manufacturing it or beginning to in Central Asia.
It's interesting.
Probably add to that there was a risk of piracy, as in pirates. One of the reasons the lighthouse was built was it was supposed to sort of say, this is a safe shore on which to land. And there were rumours that before the lighthouse, pirates knew that that there was some activity there. So they were called wreckers at the time rather than pirates, as they brought about shipwrecks. And there is a period, when a group in Andalusia that was causing havoc there were evicted and they became pirates, and then they would actually land in Alexandria, for their sort of break, stay the night in Alexandria, then go back to sea. And then one day they actually decided to try and sort of revolt in Alexandria and take the city, and they took it for not too long. But so that was a threat as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think we've probably got time for one more question. Oh, there's a gentleman that just caught my eye at the back there, with the glasses on.
I'd like to learn a little bit about your travels through Soviet Central Asia that you kind of hinted at the beginning, Colin. And I wonder if you could also, all three of you, comment a little bit about people on the move, whether in the Mediterranean, in Asia, in the Indian Ocean. We've all talked about it, but it's a way of life. And in Inner Asia, at least, you also find nomads who connect different parts of the road, of the Silk Roads. And perhaps you could elaborate a little bit about that way of life. It seems to be kind of lost.
Yes, well, I won't bore you with my travels in Soviet Asia. So, yes, the movements of people, it was constant. The traders, the Sogdian traders, who were the classic traders of the Central Silk Road, they would be gone for years. There's in this British Library exhibition, which is just across the road there, there's an extraordinary letter from a woman complaining bitterly that her husband has disappeared for 3 years, a Sogdian trader, and she complaining to him and to her mother in a letter that was discovered by Alder Stein, that the man, she said, I'd rather be married to a pig or a dog than you. And it's all there, and there's an interesting audio of the Sogdian, translated, I think, by Professor Sims Williams, which actually describes the speaking of it in a woman's voice. And that's sort of typical of the traders of that time, moving about all the time. The nomads is a huge question. There were Hephthalites, there were Huns, the Uyghur were originally nomads, shifting and moving all the time in the tranches of empires. It's how the Uyghur came originally. They were dislodged by others. They settled in what is now Xinjiang, the persecuted Uyghur people. It's a vast subject. I don't really know how to answer it adequately, except that the Silk Road was very often going through areas that were indeed inhabited by nomads and the drifter peoples, which made for tremendous banditry, for one thing, as settled peoples thought of it. So it's a colossal question. it's the whole of that part of Central Asia, you would say. We hear about the settled peoples, but the nomads left no record of themselves because they couldn't write. So they're only recorded by the empires that recorded them, whether Chinese, Sasanian, Persian, whoever they were. That's how we know about them. And in these extraordinary letters that were discovered all across the Silk Road, just a handful of them, but some of them from quite humble people, not from imperial officials, but traders and people complaining about their wives and, you know, and just about the price of local wine or what somebody was trading in cinnamon or camphor or musk, which is a big trade. It's all there in these strange letters from some of them from the 3rd century AD. So there's wonderful evidence there of what's happening, but it's all from literate people, of course.
Any final thoughts on that question?
I mean, it's a beautiful question. There's a word that always feels to me like is the basis of civilization, whatever civilization is, which is a Greek word, which is xenia, which is this idea of guest-host friendship and the friendship between strangers and people that you know. And xenia has this root actually in Proto-Indo-European word gosti, so it goes right back sort of at least 8,000 years. And gosti, really interestingly, gives us our words guest and host and ghost, because a ghost was a visitor, whether welcome or unwelcome, but it was this sort of unwritten rule that allowed society to happen, that if you saw a figure on the horizon, rather than automatically pick up your weapons and assume that they came in order to sort of take your cattle, take your wives, burn your home, that there was this notion of gosti, that you accepted that stranger across your threshold. You took the risk of welcoming somebody who would bring new ideas, you know, new words, new blood into your home. And it feels to me that gosti is the thing that only happens when we travel. And, you know, we need a bit more gosti in our lives now, this notion that guest and host are one and the same thing.
It's a lovely thought, yeah. I mean, I was going to add something similar in the sense of, you know, certainly what Alexandria tells us is that people were welcome from different parts of the world. Nomads often decided to stay, but also that, you know, there were what we today call hotels or bed and breakfasts all over the city for hundreds of years. But also, I think, you know, on a positive note, we are very mobile. You know, through air travel, you know, credit cards, you know, the things that allow us to travel and allow, you know, that mobility to extend. So maybe that's the modern day equivalent in some ways, the tourism that helps countries' economies and that helps us meet other people. So that mobility, I think we can't forget that mobility that many of us have the privilege of having today.
Thank you. Just to remind everybody that after this event finishes, there will be books being sold outside. So if you do have any further questions, I'm sure our panellists will be happy to answer them at the book signing. But until then, Colin, Bettany and Islam, thank you so much for a really interesting session.